When I reviewed Postal Redux a couple of years ago, I was surprised by what I found. After all, I had spent the better part of 2 decades being told that Postal was one of the most violent, extreme, and offensive games ever made. Yet, 24 years after first hitting PC, I found the remake to be surprisingly tame and maybe even a bit toothless. That's why I was so excited to dive into the newest sequel, Postal 4 No Regerts. I figured that if the first Postal was controversial from the mid-1990s, I could only imagine how over-the-top offensive the new game would be. And yet again, what I found was an action game that was nowhere near as edgy or as extreme as I was led to believe. But hey, who cares about any of that? The real question is it fun? That's what we're going to find out right now when I review Postal 4 No Regerts, out now on both PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5. It's probably worth mentioning right off the top that my experience with the Postal franchise is a bit limited. I mean, I've seen the Uwe Boll movie, and I am generally familiar with the franchise, but I've really only played Postal Redux on the just-released console port of Postal 4. This certainly doesn't make me an expert on the series, but I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of the franchise now that I've seen it as both an overhead 2D action game and the more familiar first-person shooter. You once again play the Postal Dude, a constantly annoyed and foul-mouthed hero who moves to the hellish Arizona border town Edenson with his trusty dog, Champ. Of course, as luck would have it, the dude's car is immediately stolen, forcing the hard-working Grump to take on a bunch of side jobs from the colorful cast of characters in the town. It won't take long before we're knee-deep in action, excitement, and cow shit on both sides of the border. Look, as I'm sure you've figured out by now, Postal 4 isn't so much a coherent story as it is a setup for a bunch of wacky missions that poke fun at current events, pop culture, and whiny people on Twitter. This is the kind of game where you'll be slingshotting immigrants across the border in one mission, and then trying to shut down a feminist theme park in the next. These quests don't really connect or have anything to do with one another outside of purposely trying to outrage a certain part of the internet. On one hand, I think the structure actually works well for a game like Postal 4. There's a lot of variety to the mission types, and we're taught early on that just about anything can happen. I mean, there's literally a moment where the Postal Dude is turned into a cat, and it never once felt strange or out of place. This is just one of those games where the developer is going to throw every idea at the wall to see what sticks, no matter how dated or simplistic the premise is. That shotgun approach leads to a lot of random moments, including a few missions that are genuinely fun. But at the same time, there's not a lot of consistency here. I ended up having the most fun when I was tasked with completing wacky missions that involved exploring Edenson and its surrounding areas. The open world is appropriately cartoony, filled with funny details and brain-dead characters with a 3-word vocabulary. The map is surprisingly large too. Don't get me wrong, it's nowhere near the size of San Andreas or something like that. But there's a lot going on, and each location feels genuinely unique and separate. And I like that you can motor around the medium-sized sprawl by using one of those electric scooters. The open world and attention to detail is easily my favorite part of Postal 4. Unfortunately, the worst parts often involve the combat. The first-person gameplay simply isn't much fun, and the missions that emphasize the firefights tend to be a slog to get through. Look, it's fine when the combat is a secondary part of the open world, but too many of the missions have you gunning down bad guys in a series of boring corridors. There's a whole Game of Thrones section that is long and repetitive, all because the game needed to set up a not very clever and super obvious toilet joke. The problem is that these mindless shoot-'em-up missions often conclude with an even worse boss fight. It's here where you'll get a taste of the frustrating computer AI. And to make matters worse, you'll quickly run out of ammo if you lose to the boss more than 3 or 4 times. And here's hoping that you brought enough health items to survive the onslaught, because it's easy to trigger a checkpoint without having enough life to get the job done. In other words, these boss battles are a real pain. Now, if there's one thing that this game does particularly well, it's not letting you dwell on those negative feelings for too long. Almost immediately after beating an especially frustrating boss, you're whisked away to a creepy part of the map that feels like it came straight out of that movie The Witch. This is a fun mission with a genuinely spooky atmosphere that is unlike any other part of the game. The combat is exciting and the horror references are a lot of fun to spot. This is the game living up to the promise, giving us those random moments that poke fun at pop culture. Too bad the rest of the missions are so damn inconsistent. Speaking of inconsistent, I guess it's time that we start talking about the comedy. Like I said earlier, this game's trying to offend you. It's purposely pushing buttons and riling up the more sensitive side of social media. At least, that's what it's trying to do. I would argue that very few of the jokes actually land. Don't get me wrong, there are definitely some funny bits, but too much of the humor feels like it's trying too hard to be edgy. I didn't really find it offensive, but rather exhausting. It doesn't help that everything from the comedy to the gameplay to the pop culture references all feel dated. Your dude is dressed like the dude from The Big Lebowski. You visit Breaking Bad's Super Lab. And, is that the Black Lodge from Twin Peaks? Even the social commentary and edgy jokes feel like they were thought out from 2008. Worst of all, this is yet another Postal game that tackles satire in the most toothless way possible. How disappointing. Sadly, what's truly offensive about this game has nothing to do with the jokes. This game is busted, and not just in one or two simple ways. There are whole sections of this game that run at maybe 1 or 2 frames per second, making the already crummy combat so much worse. And if you think that's bad, just wait until you hear about the time that I somehow died while watching a cinema scene. When the talking ended and I could finally control my character, what I found is that I would spawn outside of the map, trapping me from actually completing the game. Even after shutting the whole thing down and reloading, I simply couldn't escape this glitch. Thankfully, I had an older save file, because without that, I would still be stuck on the side of the mountain. What's especially annoying about Postal 4 is that there are a lot of missions and moments that I genuinely enjoyed, only to have most of the good elements completely undermined by the dated jokes, bad combat, and unacceptable technical problems. I mean, I genuinely like the world that they've constructed here, and a lot of the colorful cast of characters that live in Edenson, even if many of them are trying too hard to seem edgy. There's a fun randomness to the tasks and stories that I wish we saw in more games. Unfortunately, the randomness in this particular game is too inconsistent for me to recommend Postal 4 No Regerts. Nowhere near as funny or offensive as it should be, Postal 4 No Regerts is another fun yet toothless entry in the long-running franchise. There's a good-looking open world here that is filled with funny details and quite a bit to do. Unfortunately, all the good moments are marred by terrible combat mechanics, dated jokes, and technical problems that make the game feel unfinished. In the end, Postal 4 is nowhere near as subversive as it wants to be, nor as entertaining as it should be. Hey, thanks for watching our review. If you liked what you saw here, then I want you to know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. We have a whole playlist full of hundreds of reviews exactly like this one. Well, maybe not exactly like this one. I use different words in the other reviews. In fact, I suggest that you go and verify that for yourself by watching all the other reviews, like 700 or 800 of them. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite comedy game? That is to say, a game that prioritizes comedy, not just a game with the occasional chuckle. For example, Postal 4 is technically a comedy game. Of course, the only problem is that I wasn't laughing. Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back soon with a review of Road 96 Mile Zero. If that sounds good to you, then I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.